The Southern Council brought a flawless, silk-draped noblewoman to Blackrock Castle. They expected Bridget, the limping former kitchen maid, to quietly step aside and disappear into the shadows. To the arrogant lords, it was simple math. A powerful alpha king requires a pure-blooded queen. But when King Robert returned from his patrol and saw the beautiful bride waiting to replace the woman who saved him, he didn't smile. He didn't accept their gold. Instead, he did something so terrifyingly unthinkable, it would instantly plunge the entire continent into war. Summer heat baked the courtyard stones. Dust rose from the wagon wheels and drifted toward the armory doors. Bridget sat at the wooden desk in the receiving hall. She dipped her quill into the inkwell. She crossed out a line of numbers on the merchant manifest. The price of Southern iron had doubled in a month. Clara rushed into the room. The young maid did not knock. "Riders, my lady," Clara said breathlessly. "Western lords?" Bridget asked. She set the quill down. "No," Clara shook her head. "They wear white silk. They drive gilded carriages." Bridget stood up. She smoothed the skirt of her dark green dress. She touched the leather hilt of her dagger out of habit. Robert was 2 days' ride away. He had taken Thorne and 50 men to inspect the rebuilt northern watchtowers. He left her in charge of the keep. She expected minor disputes between farmers. She did not expect white silk. She walked out into the bright courtyard. The heavy iron gates stood wide open. A long procession entered Blackrock. 4 white horses pulled a large wooden carriage trimmed with gold leaf. A dozen mounted guards rode beside it. They wore polished silver armor that caught the harsh sunlight. Their shields bore the crest of a silver dove. The crest belonged to the High Council of the White City. The local Western Guards gripped their spears tightly. They did not like Southern soldiers. The carriage stopped in the center of the yard. A man stepped out. He wore a velvet doublet and a silk cape. His dark hair was oiled and tied back. He looked around the practical, unadorned stone walls of Blackrock with a faint sneer. Bridget walked down the stone steps. She stopped on the ground level, keeping her posture straight. "I am Lord Eris," the man announced. He did not bow. "Envoy of the High Council. Where is Robert?" "King Robert patrols the northern border," Bridget replied. Her voice was calm and steady. "I am Bridget, Lady of Blackrock. I speak for him in his absence." Eris looked at her. His eyes swept over her plain, clean dress and the practical leather belt. He noticed her uneven stance. He offered a short, practiced laugh. "A quaint title," Eris said smoothly. "But I carry official decrees from the High King. I do not negotiate with wards or servants. I require proper quarters until Robert returns." He turned back to the carriage. He offered his hand to someone inside. A woman stepped down into the dust. She's breathtaking. She wore a gown of pale blue silk. Silver threads formed intricate vines along her bodice. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves over her shoulders. Her skin was flawless, untouched by sun or hardship. "This is Lady Seraphina of House Vance," Eris introduced her. Bridget felt a sudden, sharp coldness in her chest. The name struck a nerve. Victoria had belonged to House Vance. "A cousin to the woman you exiled," Eris added casually. He noticed Bridget's shift in expression. "The High Council found Victoria's actions regrettable, but we do not punish an entire noble bloodline for one arrogant fool." Seraphina looked at Bridget. She did not sneer like Victoria had. Instead, she offered a soft, pitying smile. It was somehow worse. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Bridget," Seraphina said. Her voice was melodic and perfectly pitched. "I have heard the tales. You were very brave to see the king when he was locked away. We are all very grateful for your service." She used the word service deliberately. She spoke to Bridget like a master thanking a loyal hound. Bridget did not break eye contact. She did not let her hands tremble. "Welcome to Blackrock," Bridget said. "The guest wing is in the eastern tower. My staff will show you the way." "We bring gifts," Eris interrupted. He gestured to the wagons behind the carriage. "Spices, silk, gold. The High Council wishes to recognize Robert's victory over the River Lords." Eris stepped closer to Bridget. He dropped the volume of his voice. "But the Council will never formally recognize a kingdom ruled by a warlord who shares his table with a commoner," Eris said. "It disrupts the natural order. It offends the southern courts." Bridget looked at the polished silver armor of the envoy's guards. She felt the heavy iron dagger resting on her hip. She knew how to fight assassins in the dark. She knew how to command terrified servants. But this was a different battlefield. Eris wielded laws and bloodlines, weapons she could not cut with a blade. "The natural order in this valley is determined by the people who bled for it," Bridget answered quietly. "Blood dries," Eris countered. "Lineage remains. Robert needs our grain before winter. He needs our trade routes. And he needs a legitimate queen to secure his dynasty." Eris turned and smiled at Seraphina. "Lady Seraphina is the High Council's true gift, a peace offering, a bride." The words hit the courtyard like a physical blow. The Western Guard stiffened. Clara gasped softly from the steps. Seraphina lowered her eyes modestly. She folded her delicate hands in front of her silk gown. She played the perfect, submissive noblewoman. Bridget stood perfectly still. The summer heat felt suffocating. Robert had shattered Victoria's army. He had forced the River Lords to surrender. But the political machine of the White City operated on a much larger scale. They did not send soldiers to crush Robert. They sent a beautiful woman and a pile of gold to suffocate him. They wanted to buy the king, and they intended to sweep the crippled Maid back into the ashes. "Show them to the eastern tower," Bridget ordered the guards. She did not let her voice waver. "We require hot water for bathing," Seraphina requested sweetly. "The road was terribly dusty. And please, have someone brush my horses." "Clara will arrange the baths," Bridget replied. She turned her back on the envoy. She walked up the stone steps. Her bad leg ached, but she forced herself to move with deliberate, even grace. She refused to limp in front of the southern nobles. She returned to the receiving hall. She closed the heavy oak door behind her. Only then did she lean against the wood. She closed her eyes and took a long, shaky breath. Robert had told her she was the heart of Blackrock. He had made the Western Lords kneel to her. But Blackrock was a small fortress in a vast world. Seraphina represented everything Bridget was not. She was whole. She was wealthy. She was politically valuable. Bridget walked over to the wooden desk. She looked at the merchant manifests. The numbers blurred together. Robert would return in 2 days. He would face a choice. He could reject the High Council, invite a devastating trade embargo, and risk starving his people during the next winter. Or he could accept the silk-wrapped bride and secure his kingdom's future. She placed her hand over her face. The iron cage was gone, but a new trap had just sprung. This one was made of gold, and it threatened to lock her out forever. The evening meal was quiet. The fires burned low in the stone hearths. Bridget sat at the center of the high table. Seraphina and Eris occupied the chairs to her right. The Western captains filled the lower wooden benches. They ate in tense silence, their eyes darting toward the southern guests. Seraphina poked her silver fork into a piece of roasted carrot. She did not take a bite. "The northern soil is stubborn," Seraphina observed. Her voice carried easily over the crackling fires. "Our cooks in the White City import fertile earth from the river valleys. It makes the root vegetables much sweeter. We eat what survives the frost, Bridget replied. She took a sip of water. Eris drank his wine. He wiped his mouth with a linen cloth. Survival is a noble pursuit for soldiers, Eris said, but a king must provide prosperity. The High Council brings trade agreements that will fill these empty cellars with southern wheat. Your people will never worry about frost again. Bridget cut her meat. She knew they were not talking about vegetables. They were reminding the Western lords of their poverty. Seraphina turned her delicate face toward Bridget. She offered another soft smile. I was wondering, Lady Bridget, where you studied the courtly arts, Seraphina asked. I attended the High Academy in the capital. We focused on history, poetry, and the lute. What instruments do you play? The great hall grew unnaturally still. The Western captains stopped chewing. Haftford gripped his mug tightly. Everyone knew Bridget's history. Seraphina knew it too. The question was a trap designed to humiliate. Bridget set her knife down. She looked directly into Seraphina's blue eyes. I do not play the lute, Bridget answered. Her voice did not shake. I learned history from listening to the guards. I learned mathematics by counting sacks of flour. My education took place in the kitchens below this hall. A few southern knights chuckled softly. Eris smirked. Haftford slammed his heavy mug onto the table. The loud crack silenced the laughter immediately. And she learned strategy by holding this castle when the Eastern army attacked, Haftford growled. He glared at Eris. She commands more respect here than any poet from your white towers. Seraphina's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She quickly recovered her composure. Bravery is admirable, Lord Haftford, Seraphina said sweetly. But a kingdom is not built on battles alone. It is built on alliances and bloodlines. She let the final word hang in the air. The meal finished without further incident. Bridget retreated to her bedchamber. Her bad knee throbbed from the tension. She rubbed the joint, replaying Seraphina's words in her mind. The southern woman wielded politeness like a poison. The next morning, the summer sun heated the castle corridors. Bridget walked toward the library with Clara. They carried a stack of fresh parchment. They found Seraphina standing near the grand staircase. The noblewoman examined a woven tapestry hanging on the stone wall. Eris stood a few paces behind her. The colors are very dreary, Seraphina sighed. She noticed Bridget approaching. Ah, Bridget, please have your servants take this down. My carriage holds silks that will brighten this gloomy hall. Bridget stopped. She did not look at the tapestry. The tapestries remain, Bridget stated. They depict the history of the Western banners. Seraphina waved her hand dismissively. History should not be an eyesore. Clara, fetch my steward from the courtyard. We will arrange the new decorations before the king returns. Clara froze. The young maid looked at Seraphina, then looked quickly at Bridget. She did not move. Seraphina narrowed her eyes. The sweet facade slipped slightly. Did you not hear me, girl? Go. Clara answers to me, Bridget said. She handed the stack of parchment to the maid. Take these to the library, Clara. Tell the guards to deny entry to anyone carrying southern silk. Clara nodded fast and hurried down the corridor. Seraphina dropped her hand. The soft, pitying look vanished from her face. Eris stepped forward, but Seraphina stopped him with a sharp gesture. You overstep your bounds, Seraphina told Bridget. Her voice was cold and flat. You are a guest in this keep, Bridget replied. You do not command the staff. You do not alter the walls. Seraphina closed the distance between them. She stood close enough for Bridget to smell her expensive floral perfume. She looked down at Bridget's uneven stance. Let us stop pretending, Seraphina whispered. Her tone was sharp. You played a brave role during the war. Robert feels indebted to you. The High Council understands this. You will be rewarded. Bridget kept her expression blank. I require no reward. Every servant wants a reward, Seraphina countered. We will grant you a small estate near the border. You will live comfortably. But you must leave Blackrock. I am the king's ward. I stay where he commands. Seraphina laughed. It was a harsh, dry sound. Ward, do not flatter yourself. You are a pet he keeps out of guilt. Seraphina leaned closer. Robert is a king now. He needs the High Council. He needs our gold to rebuild his army. And he needs a legitimate heir. Seraphina let her gaze drag down to Bridget's right leg. He cannot marry a cripple with soot under her fingernails. The southern lords would rebel. He will choose the crown over you. He has no other option. The words pierced Bridget's armor. They hit the exact insecurities she had fought so hard to bury. The fear of being discarded. The shame of her broken body. Bridget felt her heart pound against her ribs. She forced her hands to remain loose at her sides. She would not reach for her dagger. A blade could not solve this. Robert makes his own choices, Bridget said. Men always choose power, Seraphina replied confidently. She stepped back, restoring her polite smile. Start packing your things, Bridget. I want your chambers cleared by tomorrow. A heavy iron horn blasted from the western watchtower. 3 sharp notes echoed across the valley. It was the signal for the king's arrival. Bridget turned her head. Robert had returned a day early. Eris smoothed his velvet doublet. Excellent. The real negotiations can begin. Bridget walked toward the courtyard. She ignored the pain in her leg. She ignored Seraphina following closely behind her. She reached the top of the stone steps, just as the heavy iron gates swung open. Robert rode into the yard on his black warhorse. Thorn and the cavalry followed. Robert looked tired, his leather armor dusted with road dirt. He pulled the reins. He looked up at the steps. He saw Bridget standing there. Then, his eyes shifted to the gilded carriage, the white banners, and the southern envoys waiting behind her. His jaw tightened. The exhaustion vanished from his posture. He swung down from the saddle. The storm had arrived. The midday sun beat down on the packed earth of the courtyard. Horses stamped their hooves in the quiet yard. Robert handed his leather reins to a waiting stable hand. He did not look at the gilded carriage. He ignored the southern guards in their polished silvered armor. Eris stepped into his path. The envoy offered a sweeping, exaggerated bow. King Robert, Eris announced. His voice was loud, intended for the entire courtyard to hear. The High Council of the White City sends its regards, and its wealth. We come to celebrate your victory. Seraphina stepped forward. She dropped into a flawless curtsy. The blue silk of her gown pooled in the dust. My king, it is an honor to finally meet the true hero of the Northern Valleys. Robert did not bow. He did not offer his hand. He walked straight past them. He climbed the stone steps and stopped directly in front of Bridget. He looked at her pale face. He noticed the rigid way she held her shoulders. Report, Robert said. Bridget kept her voice level. She did not look at Seraphina. Lord Eris brings trade agreements. The High Council demands a formal alliance. They brought Lady Seraphina to seal it. Robert's expression remained hard. What else? They offered me a small estate near the border, Bridget answered. If I pack my things by tomorrow and leave. A dangerous silence fell over the steps. Robert turned around. He looked down at the southern envoy. The ambient noise in the courtyard ceased. The western guards gripped their spears tighter. Who made the offer? Robert asked. Eris smiled. He smoothed his velvet doublet, entirely missing the lethal shift in the atmosphere. It was a generosity, King Robert, Eris explained smoothly. The girl served her purpose during your captivity. The council recognizes that. But the White City requires a proper court. Lady Seraphina is of noble blood. She brings the legitimacy you need to secure this region. I won this valley with steel, Robert said. I do not need a piece of parchment from the south to tell me I hold it. You need grain, Eris countered. His polite tone vanished, replaced by cold calculation. Your cellars are half empty. The eastern fields burned during the rebellion. Without our trade routes, your people will starve before the first snow. The council offers survival, Robert. You only have to discard the Maid. Serafina looked up at Robert. She widened her blue eyes, playing the role of the sympathetic savior. Robert looked at the wagons parked behind the carriage. They were piled high with burlap sacks of wheat and heavy wooden chests. He walked down the stone steps. He stopped inches from Eris. "Thorn," Robert called out. He did not look away from the envoy. Captain Thorn stepped forward immediately. "Yes, my king. Unload the grain wagons. Put the sacks in the lower cellars." Eris crossed his arms. A triumphant smile spread across his face. "You accept the terms, then. A wise choice for a new king." "I accept the grain," Robert stated. He turned his gaze to Serafina. "Leave the gold in the carriage. You will ride back to the White City this afternoon." Serafina gasped softly. Her perfect composure cracked. She stepped forward, reaching a delicate hand toward Robert's arm. "You cannot be serious," Serafina said. Her voice lost its melodic pitch. "You would reject the High Council for her? She is a cripple." Robert looked at Serafina's outstretched hand. He did not move, but the sheer menace in his amber eyes made her pull her fingers back instantly. "I do not take orders from the south," Robert said quietly. "And I do not trade my family for wheat." Eris's face flushed deep red. The insult was absolute. "This is an act of war!" Eris shouted. He pointed a shaking finger at Robert. "You steal our supplies and humiliate a noble house. The council will blockade your borders. We will cut off the salt roads. You will freeze in this ruin." "Let them try," Robert replied. He turned his back on the envoys. "Thorn, escort our guests to the gates once the grain is unloaded. If they refuse to leave, throw them in the moat." Halford laughed loudly from the armory doors. The Western soldiers joined in, a chorus of rough, mocking cheers directed at the Southern guards. Eris grabbed Serafina's arm. He dragged her back toward the gilded carriage. The white horses nervously stamped the ground. Robert walked back up the stairs. He placed his hand on Bridget's lower back and batted her through the heavy hick doors. An hour later, the carriage rolled out of the courtyard. The iron gates slammed shut. The heavy wooden bars fell into place with a loud thud. Bridget sat in the library. She stared at the open ledger on the desk. The numbers still meant nothing. Her heart beat rapidly against her ribs. The door opened. Robert walked in. He had removed his leather armor and washed the dirt from his face. He wore a simple black linen shirt. He poured a cup of water from a clay pitcher and drank it. He leaned against the heavy oak table, watching her. "They will blockade us," Bridget said. She did not look up from the book. "I know," Robert replied. Serafina was right about the food. The eastern harvest was ruined. We have enough to feed the castle now that we took their wagons, but the outer villages will suffer when winter comes. We will hunt. We will ration the stores. Bridget closed the ledger. She finally looked up at him. "You made an enemy of the largest army on the continent. You chose war. Because of me. I made an enemy of them because they tried to buy my kingdom," Robert corrected. "And because they insulted you." "It is a heavy price for pride." Robert set his cup down. He walked around the table. He stopped beside her chair. "It is not pride," Robert said. His voice was low and steady. "Eris called you a servant. He called you a pet. They look at you and see a broken girl. I look at you and see the woman who kept me breathing in the dark." Bridget looked at her hands. The memory of Seraphina's mocking voice still stung. "They see my leg," Bridget whispered. "They see the soot. The world outside these walls will never accept me, Robert. A king needs a queen they respect. Then we will not let the world inside these walls." Robert knelt. He lowered his massive frame until he was eye level with her. He reached out and took both of her hands in his. "Do you want the estate?" Robert asked. He searched her face. "Do you want to leave the politics and the war behind? If you ask for peace, I will find a way to give it to you." Bridget met his amber eyes. She thought of the quiet border. She thought of the safety. Then she thought of the iron cage, the rain, and the dagger resting against her hip. She tightened her grip on his calloused hands. "No," Bridget said firmly. "My place is here." Robert nodded once. A fierce satisfaction settled in his expression. The tension in his jaw relaxed. "Good," he said. He stood up. "Because the High Council will not stop at a blockade. They sent Seraphina to test my grip on the throne. When they realize I will not bend, they will send soldiers." "We just finished one war," Bridget said. "Peace is a luxury we cannot afford yet." Robert looked toward the tall windows. The summer sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the floorboards. "Eris thinks we are weak because our cellars are not overflowing. He thinks starvation will break the Western banners before they even march." Bridget stood up. She picked up her quill. She turned to a fresh page in the heavy ledger. The fear was gone, replaced by the cold, practical logic that had kept her alive in the scullery. "Then we must prove him wrong," Bridget said. "Send riders to the fishing villages on the western coast. Tell them we will buy their entire autumn catch. We will salt the fish and store it in the eastern wing." Robert watched her. He saw the shift in her posture. She was no longer shrinking from the threat. She was planning to dismantle it. "I will dispatch the riders tonight," Robert agreed. "And we must audit the armory again," she continued, her quill scratching rapidly against the parchment. "If the South marches, they will bring heavy siege engines. Our wooden shields will splinter. We need Thorn to oversee the smiths. We need iron plating for the gates." "It will be done." Bridget set the quill down. She looked at Robert. "Seraphina wanted to replace the tapestries in the hall," Bridget noted. "She thought the history of this castle was too dreary." "She does not understand what it takes to survive the cold," Robert said. "No, she does not," Bridget replied. She touched the hilt of her dagger. "But she will learn." The autumn wind howled through the northern passes. It carried the bitter scent of pine and early frost. Bridget stood in the lower cellars. The air was damp and cold. Wooden barrels lined the stone walls, filled with the salted fish she had secured weeks ago. But the salt piles in the adjacent room were shrinking rapidly. The White City had choked the southern trade routes entirely. No merchant caravans crossed the river. The blockade was silent, but it was deadly. She held a piece of charcoal. She marked a tally on the heavy wooden ledger board. "We must cut the meat rations again," Brigitte said. Hafford stood beside her. He frowned at the barrels. "The men train hard in the yards. They need strength to swing a sword. You cannot feed an army on thin broth." "They cannot swing a sword if they starve in January," Bridget replied. She wiped her charcoal-stained fingers on a rough rag. "We boil the animal bones for marrow. We mix the remaining flour with ground acorns to stretch the bread. It will keep them standing." Hafford sighed deeply. He did not argue. He had seen the empty grain silos before the southern wagons arrived. He knew her math was unforgiving, but it was correct. "The men complain," Hafford warned gently. "They remember the feasts after the rebellion." "Let them complain to me," Bridget stated. "Hunger breeds anger. Better they direct it at me than lose faith in the king." She left the cellars and walked across the courtyard toward the armory. The forge fire burned hot against the stone walls. Sparks flew as hammers struck red-hot steel. Captain Thorne wiped sweat from his forehead as Bridget approached. "The new shields are coming along, my lady," Thorne reported. He pointed to a stack of iron-banded heavy wood. But we are running low on raw iron. The smiths cannot forge the gate reinforcements without it. Before Bridget could answer, a scout ran into the courtyard. His boots clattered loudly against the paving stones. "Captain Thorne, Lady Bridget," the scout panted. He stopped and caught his breath. "The border patrol caught a caravan trying to slip past the eastern ridge. They claim they are merchants." Bridget followed Thorne back out to the daylight. The courtyard quickly bustled with tense energy. 3 covered wooden wagons sat deep in the mud. 6 men stood surrounded by Western spearmen. Their leader was a lean man with a scarred cheek and a heavy wool coat. His name was Cale. Robert stood near the main keep doors. He watched the scene with cold detachment. He did not step forward to take charge. Bridget walked to the center of the yard. Cale looked at her plain green dress. He sneered openly. "Tell your men to lower their spears, girl," Cale demanded. "I have valuable goods to sell. I want to see the king." Bridget stopped in front of him. She did not flinch at his tone. "You're speaking to the Lady of Blackrock," Bridget said. "State your business." Cale looked past her. He raised his voice and yelled toward Robert. "I don't deal with kitchen wenches. I brought iron and salt." Robert did not move from the stairs. He simply rested his hand on his sword hilt. His voice carried across the quiet yard with lethal clarity. "You deal with her," Robert ordered, "or you deal with the hangman. Choose." Cale swallowed hard. His arrogant posture deflated instantly. He turned his attention back to Bridget, suddenly realizing the danger he was in. "We bypassed the southern blockades," Cale muttered. He gestured nervously to the heavy wagons. "It is highly dangerous work. The High Council patrols the river crossings day and night. If they catch us smuggling, they cut off our hands." "What did you bring?" Bridget asked. 10 crates of rock salt. 5 bundles of unshaped iron for your forge." Cale smiled thinly, trying to regain his confidence. "The price is 50 gold pieces." Hafford cursed loud from the sidelines. 50? That is pure robbery. The standard rate is 10. "The standard rate applies during peace," Cale replied. He crossed his arms tightly. "You are desperate. The snow is coming fast. You pay my price, or I take my wagons back to the eastern coast." Bridget walked toward the first wagon. She pulled the heavy canvas cover back. She looked at the wooden crates stacked inside. She traced a crude branding mark burned into the wood. It was a faded crest belonging to a minor river lord. She dropped the canvas. She turned back to Cale. "You did not buy these goods," Bridget stated calmly. "You looted them from the abandoned river keeps after the war." Cale tensed. His hand drifted slowly toward the hunting knife on his belt. Thorne immediately raised his spear. The Western guards stepped closer, forming a tight ring of pointed steel around the smugglers. Bridget did not step back. She did not reach for her own dagger. She relied entirely on the sheer weight of her authority. "The White Council patrols the main roads, yes," Bridget continued. Her voice was flat and analytical. "But they do not care about your hands. They will hang you for looting noble property. You cannot take these wagons east because the Southern Army holds the river. You cannot go north because the mountain passes will freeze your horses." She took one deliberate step closer to Cale. "You brought these goods here because Black Rock is your only safe harbor. You have no leverage." Cale stared at her. The confidence completely bled out of him. He realized he was trapped. The frail-looking woman had dismantled his entire bargaining position in 3 feeble sentences. 15 gold pieces, Bridget offered. "That barely covers the winter feed for my horses," Cale spat. 15 gold pieces, Bridget repeated, "and we allow you to spend the winter in the lower town. You will have a warm hearth and a solid roof. If you refuse, we confiscate the wagons and throw you out into the frost." Cale looked at the armed guards. He looked at the imposing figure of Robert standing by the doors. Finally, he looked at Bridget's unwavering eyes. 15, Cale agreed bitterly. Bridget nodded. Captain Thorne, unload the wagons. Pay the man from the lower treasury. The guards directed the heavy carts toward the storage cellars. The courtyard slowly returned to its normal routine. Cale and his men walked away, casting resentful glances over their shoulders. Robert walked across the yard. He stopped beside Bridget. He looked at the retreating smugglers. "You have a ruthless mind," Robert observed quietly. Bridget wiped a spot of mud from her skirt. "I spent my life watching merchants cheat the head cook. They always exaggerate their risks to drive up the price. I simply used his fear against him." "He wanted to intimidate you." "He tried," Bridget said. She looked up at him. "He failed." Robert smiled faintly. It was a rare expression, reserved entirely for her. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. The sky above them turned a dull, heavy gray. The temperature dropped sharply within minutes. The autumn wind died down, replaced by an eerie, breathless stillness. A small white flake drifted down from the thick clouds. It landed on Bridget's dark wool sleeve. It sat there, refusing to melt immediately. "The first snow," Bridget murmured. Robert looked up at the sky. His amber eyes hardened. The memory of the iron cage always returned with the frost. He instinctively tightened his jaw. His shoulders grew rigid under his leather armor. Bridget noticed the subtle shift. She knew exactly where his mind was going. She reached out and took his hand. Her warm fingers slipped firmly over his scarred knuckles. "We have salt," Bridget said softly. She grounded him in the present. "We have iron. We have grain." Robert looked down at their joined hands. The tension slowly left his muscles. The ghosts of the winter past retreated, banished by her simple touch. "We are ready," Robert said. The snow began to fall faster, dusting the stone courtyard in a thin layer of white. The siege of attrition had officially begun. The Southern Army had not yet marched, but the High Council had unleashed the brutal northern winter against them. Bridget stood beside the king. She did not feel the bone-deep terror she used to feel when the frost arrived. She felt the heavy iron dagger resting on her belt. She felt the solid weight of Robert's hand enclosing hers. The White City wanted to freeze them out. They did not understand that Black Rock had already survived the absolute worst the cold could offer. They would hold the line. Snow buried Black Rock Castle in a thick white blanket. Ice clung to the heavy stone walls, freezing the moat into solid glass. 3 weeks passed since the first frost. The White City's blockade held tight. No merchants arrived. The western valleys fell silent. Bridget sat in the library. She wrapped a thick wool shawl tightly around her shoulders. The hearth fire burned low to conserve dry wood. She stared at the grain ledgers. The numbers were brutal. She had cut the lower town's rations twice. Men grew desperate when their children cried from hunger. The heavy door banged open. Hafford rushed into the room. Snow melted from his gray beard. "Riot," Hafford gasped. He leaned heavily against the doorframe. "Lower courtyard. They are trying to breach the southern silos." Bridget stood up. She closed the ledger. "Who is leading them?" "Townsfolk. A few off-duty guards joined them," Hafford said grimly. "They brought axes. The king is already on his way." Bridget hurried past the old general. She ignored the sharp ache in her knee as she descended the spiraling stone stairs. She pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped into the biting wind. A crowd of 50 people pressed against the iron-bound doors of the grain silo. They shouted angrily. Their breath formed thick white clouds in the freezing air. A man named Corin stood at the front. He claimed to be a refugee from the river skirmishes. He swung a heavy woodcutter's axe, biting deep into the thick oak door. They feast in the high keep while we freeze, Corin roared. Break the lock! Step away from the door! Robert's voice cut through the shouting. It lacked any warmth. It was the voice of the Iron Wolf. Robert marched into the lower courtyard. Captain Thorne and a dozen heavily armed guards flanked him. Robert did not wear a cloak. He wore his steel breastplate and dark leather. The crowd wavered. Fear rippled through the front lines, but hunger made them reckless. "You starve us," a woman screamed from the back. Corin raised his axe again. "He will let us die to spite the South. Take the grain." Robert drew his broadsword. The steel hissed cleanly over the howling wind. "Anyone who touches that door loses their hand," Robert commanded. He stepped forward, his amber eyes locked onto Corin. "Drop the axe." Corin hesitated, but he tightened his grip on the wooden handle. He looked at the angry faces behind him, drawing courage from the mob. He swung the axe toward the iron lock. Robert lunged. He moved with terrifying speed. He raised his broadsword, preparing to sever Corin's arm. "Stop!" Bridget shoved her way through the line of guards. She stepped directly between Robert's raised blade and the rioting crowd. Robert aborted the swing mid-air. He pulled his muscles back so violently he nearly lost his footing on the ice. The heavy steel blade stopped mere inches from Bridget's shoulder. "Bridget, move," Robert ordered. His chest heaved. Anger flushed his face. "Sheathe the sword," Bridget said. She did not yell, but her tone offered no room for debate. Robert stared at her. He looked at the rebellious crowd, then back to the woman standing fearlessly beneath his blade. Slowly, he lowered the weapon and slid it back into its scabbard. Bridget turned her back on the king. She faced the mob. She did not flinch from their angry stares. She limped forward, closing the distance until she stood toe-to-toe with Corin. "You are hungry," Bridget addressed the crowd. Her voice was clear and steady. "Your hands ache from the cold. I know this. I spent 19 years starving in the kitchens beneath your feet. I know what an empty belly does to the mind." The crowd quieted. They knew her history. She wore fine wool now, but they remembered her scrubbing the courtyard stones. "The king does not feast," Bridget continued. "He eats the same salted fish you eat. I measure the portions myself. If we open these silos today, you will eat well for a week, and then you will all starve to death in January." The angry shouts died down entirely. The harsh reality of her words sank in. Corin scowled. He realized he was losing control of the mob. "Lies!" Corin shouted. He pointed a dirty finger at her. "The High Council offered us trade. They offered grain. You rejected it because you wanted to play the High Lady." Bridget looked at Corin. She studied his face. She looked at his heavy wool coat. "You arrived here a month ago," Bridget said. She narrowed her eyes. "You said the Eastern Lords burned your farm." "They did," Corin spat. "A farmer works the earth," Bridget observed quietly. She reached out quickly and grabbed Corin's left hand. Corin tried to pull away, but she held his wrist firmly. She held a hand up for the crowd to see. "Look at his palm," Bridget commanded. The skin was smooth. There were no heavy calluses from gripping a plow. There were no deep scars from chopping wood. "And look at his boots," Bridget pointed down. Corin wore thick, sturdy leather boots lined with fur. The rest of the refugees wore thin leather wrapped in rags. "A starving refugee does not own southern riding boots," Bridget stated. She let go of his hand and took a step back. "Captain Thorne, search his coat." Corin panicked. He dropped the axe and tried to run. Thorne tackled into the snow. The captain pinned Corin to the ground and ripped open the heavy wool coat. A small leather pouch spilled onto the ice. Several heavy silver coins scattered across the white snow. They bore the crest of the silver dove. The crowd gasped. The anger that had been directed at Robert instantly shifted toward Corin. The rioters realized they had been manipulated. "The White City pays you to incite riots," Bridget said coldly. She looked down at the struggling spy. "They want us to tear each other apart from the inside. They want us to break our own doors." She turned back to the townsfolk. "The South views you as weapons. They will let you freeze the moment you serve you purpose, Bridget declared. But we will hold this keep. Go back to your fires. The extra grain stays locked. The crowd dispersed immediately. Shame replaced their rage. They picked up their tools and walked quietly back toward the lower town. Thorn dragged Corin to his feet. To the dungeons, my king? Robert watched the retreating townsfolk. He looked at the silver coins resting on the ice. Finally, he looked at Bridget. Ask the Lady of Blackrock, Robert replied. Bridget met Thorn's gaze. Lock him in the lower cells. Give him half a ration of water. He will tell us how he communicates with the southern blockades by morning. Thorn saluted and dragged the spy away. The courtyard emptied. Only Robert and Bridget remained in the freezing wind. Robert stepped close to her. He pulled his heavy dark cloak from his shoulders and wrapped it around her. The thick wool held his body heat. You stepped under my blade, Robert said. His voice was rough. You would not have struck me, Bridget answered. She pulled the cloak tighter. I almost did. Robert looked at the deep axe mark on the silo door. When they challenge the walls, my instinct is to kill. I only know how to broke an enemy. They are not the enemy, Robert. They are just afraid. Robert looked down at her. The winter wind whipped his dark hair across his face. I can win a war on a battlefield, Robert admitted quietly. But I would have lost the castle today. Fear stops a sword, but it does not stop a starving mob. He reached out and gently touched her cheek. His fingers were cold, but his touch was incredibly soft. You rule the heart of this valley, Bridget. You did not just survive the scullery, you weaponized it. Bridget aimed to his hand. The biting cold of the courtyard faded away. We fight the winter together, she whispered. Always, Robert vowed. He offered his arm. Bridget took it. They walked back toward the heavy oak doors of the keep. The snow continued to fall, burying the silver coins under a fresh layer of white. The southern trap had failed. Blackrock remained united, guarded by the king's steel and the lady's iron will. The lower cell smelled of damp earth and rust. Torches flickered against the wet stone walls. Robert stood on the dry side of the iron bars. Bridget sat beside him on a wooden stool. Captain Thorn stood near the door, holding a ring of heavy keys. Corin shivered on the floor of the cell. He pulled his thin wool blanket tightly around his shoulders. He looked up at Robert, his eyes wide with exhaustion. I told the captain everything, Corin mumbled, his teeth chattered. Tell us, Robert said. Corin swallowed hard. Lord Eris sent a raven 3 days ago. The blockade holds. But he knows you secured grain and salt. He knows starvation will take too long. What is the new objective? Bridget asked. She kept her voice steady. The mountain aqueduct, Corin answered. Eris sent 50 soldiers up the northern ridge. They carry heavy pickaxes and sulfur powder. They plan to shatter the stone supports. Bridget exchanged a look with Robert. The aqueduct carried fresh spring water from the high peaks directly into the castle's inner cisterns. If they break the channel, the fresh water stops, Robert said. He turned to Thorn. We would have to rely on the moat. The stagnant water breeds rot. Disease would sweep through the lower town in weeks, Bridget added. She stood up. They cannot reach those pillars. They marched yesterday, Corin said. He pressed his back against the stone wall. They will reach the gorge by sunset. Robert turned away from the cell. He walked toward the spiraling stairs. Thorn and Bridget followed him. They reached the armory. The forge fires cast long orange shadows across the room. Saddle the horses, Robert ordered Thorn. Gather 20 men, light armor only. We need speed. The snow is deep in the pass, Thorn warned. Heavy cavalry will struggle. We ride light, Robert pleaded. Move. Thorn saluted and ran toward the stables. Bridget watched Robert buckle his leather breastplate. He checked the straps on his vambraces. His movements were precise and rigid. He was preparing for violence. 20 men against 50, Bridget noted. We have the high ground if we ride fast, Robert replied. He slid his broadsword into its scabbard. "They carry heavy mining tools. They will be tired." Bridget reached into the deep pocket of her skirt. She pulled out a thick, dark gray wool scarf. She had spent the last 3 evenings knitting it near the library fire. She walked over to him. She held the wool out. Robert stopped checking his armor. He looked at the scarf, then down at her. "The mountain wind bites through leather," Bridget said. She stepped closer. She wrapped the thick wool around his neck. She tucked the ends securely beneath the edge of his leather pauldron. Her hands lingered for a fraction of a second against his cold armor. Robert felt the heat of her fingers. The scarf carried the distinct, comforting scent of hearth smoke and old parchment. It smelled like the library. It smelled like home. "I will hold the gates," Bridget said. Robert nodded. He did not offer empty promises of safety. He turned and walked out into the freezing courtyard. Snow lashed the jagged mountain peaks. The stone aqueduct spanned a narrow, dizzying gorge. Robert dismounted. He crouched low behind a cluster of snow-covered boulders. Thorn and the 20 riders crouched beside him. They breathed quietly, gripping their drawn weapons. Below them, 50 Southern soldiers worked in the freezing wind. They chipped at the thick stone base of the central pillar. The rhythmic crack of metal against rock echoed the canyon. Several men packed dark sulfur powder into the fresh crevices. Robert assessed the gorge. The path was narrow. Numbers mattered less here than ferocity. He drew his broadsword. He stood up. "Now," Robert commanded. He charged down the snowy incline. His boots crunched loudly against the ice. The Western soldiers roared, surging out from the rocks behind him. The Southern soldiers dropped their pickaxes. They scrambled to draw their swords. Robert crashed into their front line. He swung his heavy blade, catching a soldier's wooden shield. The wood splintered. Robert stepped forward, driving his shoulder into the man's chest and knocking him into the snow. The clash of steel rang through the narrow pass. Men slipped on the icy ground. Robert fought with relentless momentum. He parried a thrust from a spearman and struck back. He pushed forward, forcing the Southern soldiers away from the stone pillar. A tall Southern captain pushed through the chaos. He wielded a heavy mace. He swung it in a wide arc. Robert raised his shield. The iron mace crashed against the wood. The sheer force of the blow shattered Robert's shield and threw him backward. Robert fell hard. He tumbled down a short embankment and crashed into a deep snowbank. Freezing snow packed tightly around him. It buried his arms and chest. The biting cold seeped instantly through his leather gloves and seeped into his skin. His lungs seized. His vision blurred. The gray sky overhead twisted. The sounds of battle faded, replaced by the howling wind of a past winter. He felt the cold iron bars pressing against his back. He heard the rattle of heavy chains. The paralyzing terror of the cage flooded his mind, locking his muscles in place. He could not breathe. He could not move. The Southern captain slid down the snowy bank. He raised his iron mace high above his head, ready to deliver a crushing strike. Robert stared at the descending weapon. He felt nothing but the freezing mud of his memories. Then, he smelled hearth smoke. The thick wool scarf pressed against his neck. The familiar scent pierced the panic. "You are not in the yard." Bridget's calm voice echoed in his mind. He remembered the heat of her hand over his. He remembered her standing fearlessly under his raised sword in the courtyard. The illusion of the iron cage shattered. Robert gasped for air. He rolled violently to his left. The heavy mace smashed into the snowbank, striking empty ground. Robert sprang to his feet. He gripped his broadsword with both hands. He did not hesitate. He swung the blade low, striking the captain's unarmored knee. The man fell with a shout of pain. Robert disarmed him and kicked the mace away. He climbed back up the embankment. The panic was gone. A cold, clear focus replaced it. He rejoined the fight. Thorne and the Western soldiers pressed their advantage. Without their captain, the Southern troops broke. They abandoned their explosives and fled down the mountain trail. Robert stood near the stone pillar. He leaned heavily on his sword. Blood dripped from a deep cut on his left forearm. He watched the enemy retreat into the blinding snow. "The aqueduct holds, my king," Thorne said, panting heavily. Robert touched the wool scarf at his neck. "Gather the men. We ride home." The fire crackled warmly in Robert's bedchamber. The heavy drapes blacked out the winter storm. Robert sat on the edge of the mattress. He had stripped off his armor. His left arm rested on a small wooden table. Bridget sat in a chair beside him. She held a curved needle and thick linen thread. A basin of hot water and clean rags sat nearby. She cleaned the cut on his forearm carefully. She did not flinch at the sight of his torn flesh. "This will sting," Bridget said softly. "Do it," Robert replied. She pushed the needle through his skin. Her hands were steady. She pulled the thread tight, closing the wound with precise, even stitches. Robert watched her face. The firelight cast warm shadows across her features. "I fell during the fight," Robert said. His voice was low in the quiet room. Bridget paused. She looked up at him. "Thorne said you slipped on the ice." "I did not slip." Robert looked away, staring into the hearth fire. "A soldier knocked me into a snowbank. The cold covered me. I forgot where I was. I felt the iron bars again. I could not move." Bridget set the needle down. She reached out and touched his uninjured arm. "But you moved," she said. Robert turned his head to look at her. "I smelled the smoke on the scarf. I remembered your voice. You pulled me out of the snow, Bridget." He reached up with his right hand. He covered her hand where it rested on his arm. "The cage does not hold me anymore," Robert stated. He spoke the words like a vow. "You broke the lock." Bridget smiled. It was a gentle, genuine expression that reached her eyes. "Then the winter cannot hurt us," Bridget said. She picked up the needle and finished the last stitch. She tied the thread and snipped it with small iron shears. She wrapped a clean linen bandage around his arm. Robert watched her hands work. He felt a profound, grounding peace settle in his chest. The White City could send assassins, blockades, and blizzards, but as long as Bridget sat by his fire, the Iron Wolf would never freeze again. Torches illuminated the great hall. Pine branches decorated the stone hearths. Bridget watched the soldiers eat. She had managed the rations carefully. Tonight, she allowed an extra portion of salted fish and baked apples. The men laughed. The tension of the long winter eased slightly. Robert sat beside her. He drank his ale and watched the room. "They sing again," Robert noted.
"Fear makes men quiet," Bridget replied. "A full stomach gives them a voice." Halford stood at the lower table. He raised his wooden mug. "To the Lady of Blackrock," Halford bellowed. "She kept the cellars full and the spy in chains." The Western soldiers cheered. They raised their cups. They banged their fists on the heavy oak tables. Bridget felt a flush of heat in her cheeks. She nodded to the old general. The heavy oak doors slammed open. A scout staggered into the hall. Snow covered his leather armor. His breath came in ragged gasps. The music stopped. The laughter died. Robert stood up. He did not raise his voice. "Report!" "The Southern vanguard," the scout panted. "They crossed the frozen river. They march for the gates. They bring siege towers." Halford frowned. "In this snow? Eris risks losing half his men to frostbite." "Eris grows desperate," Robert said. He turned to Thorne. "Gather the captains in the library." The library fire crackled. Shadows danced across the parchment map on the table. Thorn traced a route with his finger. They carry 3 wooden siege engines. The wheels are wrapped in iron. They will try to cross the frozen moat and breach the western wall. Robert studied the map. We have 200 men. Eris brings 1,000. If they reach the wall, their numbers will overwhelm us. We sally out, Hafred suggested. We meet them in the snow before they deploy the towers. Heavy infantry dominates the open snow, Bridget said. She stepped closer to the table. The men looked at her. They did not dismiss her words. What do you suggest? Robert asked. We use the ice, Bridget answered. The moat froze thick in December, but the spring thaw approaches. The ice supports a man. It will not support a siege tower. Thorn shook his head. Eris knows that. His engineers will test the ice before they cross. Then we ensure the ice passes their test, Bridget said, until we decide it should fail. She looked at Robert. Corrin's men left 3 crates of sulfur powder on the mountain. We brought them back. Robert's eyes widened slightly. He saw the plan immediately. We plant the powder beneath the moat, Robert finished. We crack the ice ourselves. The lower cellars smelled of salt and damp earth. Robert used an iron crowbar to pry the wooden lid off a captured crate. Bridget held a lantern. The yellow light illuminated the dark powder inside. Sulfur and ground charcoal, Robert noted. He rubbed the powder between his fingers. Eris meant to bring down the mountain with this. Now it will bring down his pride, Bridget said. Robert looked at her. You have changed. You used to fear the violence. I still fear it, Bridget answered. She set the lantern on a barrel. But I fear losing our home more. I will not let them drag you back into the dark. Robert stepped close to her. He wiped the dark powder from his hands with a rag. They cannot touch me, Robert said. You stand guard. He kissed her forehead. It was a brief, grounding touch. They returned to the stairs to finish the preparations. The morning sky burned dull gray. Cold wind swept across the stone battlements. Bridget stood on the western wall. She wore her thick wool cloak. Robert stood beside her, wearing his steel breastplate. The Southern army formed ranks across the valley. 1,000 men wore polished silver armor. They carried long spears and kite shields. 3 wooden siege towers loomed behind their lines. Eris rode forward on a white horse. He stopped a safe distance from the moat. King Robert, Eris shouted. His voice carried on the wind. The High Council offers one final chance. Surrender the keep, open the gates, and we will spare your men. Robert rested his hands on the stone parapet. He did not shout back. He waited. Eris scowled. He spurred his horse back to his lines. He raised his hand and signaled the advance. War horns blew. The Southern infantry marched forward. They pushed the heavy siege towers over the snow. The wooden wheels groaned under the immense weight. Thorn stood near the gatehouse. He held a burning torch. A long linen fuse trailed down the stone wall and disappeared into the frozen moat. Hold, Robert commanded. The first Southern soldiers stepped onto the ice. They moved cautiously. The frozen moat held their weight. They cross, Hafred muttered. Hold, Robert repeated. The siege towers reached the edge of the moat. The engineers urged the men forward. The first tower rolled onto the ice. The frozen surface groaned, but it did not break. The second tower followed. Then the third. Hundreds of Southern soldiers crowded the frozen moat, pushing the engines toward the wall. They reached the center. Now, Robert said. Thorn lowered the torch. The fuse sparked. A tiny trail of fire raced down the wall. Bridget held her breath. A deep, muffled thud shook the earth. The sound resonated in Bridget's chest. 3 violent explosions erupted beneath the moat. Geysers of freezing water and jagged ice shot into the air. The thick surface of the moat shattered instantly. A web of deep cracks sprinted across the ice, destabilizing the entire expanse. The Southern soldiers screamed. The ice broke beneath their boots. Hundreds of men plunged into the freezing, stagnant water. The siege towers leaned drastically. Their iron wheels sank through the broken ice. The heavy wooden structures tipped forward. They crashed into the dark water with a deafening splinter of wood. Panic seized the Southern vanguard. Men thrashed in the freezing moat. Their heavy silver armor pulled them down. Those who survived scrambled back toward the snowy banks, abandoning their weapons. Eris watched from the rear line, his face drained of color. His siege engines lay ruined. His vanguard was broken without a single sword drawn. Robert drew his broadsword. He raised it high. The Western guards on the wall cheered. They banged their spears against their shields. The sound echoed across the valley, a thunderous declaration of victory. Robert turned to Bridget. He sheathed his sword. The wind whipped her dark hair around her face. Her eyes shone with triumph. He reached out and took her hand. He lifted her knuckles to his lips and kissed her skin in front of his entire army. "You broke their lines with a thought," Robert said. "They relied on force," Bridget replied. "We relied on the ground." Eris wheeled his horse around. He ordered the retreat. The surviving Southern soldiers fled back across the snow, leaving their dead in the freezing water. The High Council had sent their best weapons. Blackrock had crushed them. The winter siege was over. Spring sunlight warmed the courtyard stones. Meltwater dripped from the high battlements and pooled in the dark mud. The ice covering the moat fractured into jagged sheets, revealing the murky water below. Bridget stood near the armory doors. She watched the blacksmiths repair farm tools. The swords and shields sat quietly on their wooden racks. Trade had resumed 3 days ago. Merchant caravans crossed the western ridges, bringing fresh meat and early vegetables. The White City blockade had vanished overnight. A horn sounded from the front gate. It blew a single, sustained note indicating a diplomatic arrival. Bridget walked toward the stone steps. Robert emerged from the keep to meet her. They stood together as the heavy iron gates groaned open. A small procession rode into Blackrock. They did not bring gilded carriages or white silk banners. 10 riders wore plain gray wool over chainmail. The lead rider dismounted. He was an older man with sharp features and gray hair. He carried a rolled parchment. Another man fell from the back of a horse. He hit the muddy ground heavily. Iron chains bound his wrists and ankles. His expensive velvet doublet was torn and stained with dirt. Bridget recognized the prisoner immediately. It was Eris. "I am Vane," the older man announced. He bowed respectfully toward Robert and Bridget. "I speak for the High Council. We come to offer a formal end to the hostilities." Robert did not step down from the stairs. "You sent an army to break my walls. Now you send 10 men to ask for peace." "Eris acted without the council's consent," Vane replied smoothly. He gestured toward the shivering man in the mud. "He manufactured the blockade. He ordered the siege. The High Council condemns his rogue actions. We bring him to you as a gesture of our good faith." Bridget watched Eris struggle to his knees. The former envoy looked broken. The arrogant sneer was gone, replaced by raw terror. "Bring them inside," Robert ordered. The great hall felt hollow despite the roaring hearth fires. Robert and Bridget sat at the high table. Hafford stood nearby, resting his hand on his sword hilt. Vane stood in the center of the room. 2 northern guards forced Eris to his knees before the table. Vane unrolled his parchment. "The Council recognizes the sovereignty of Blackrock. We offer open borders. We ask for a signed treaty to restore peace to the valleys." "A piece of paper does not rebuild the villages Eris starved," Bridget said. Vane looked at her. He did not dismiss her presence. He calculated his next move carefully. We agree, Lady Bridget, Vane said. He reached under his grey cloak. He drew a polished short sword and laid it on the heavy oak table. The steel gleamed in the firelight.
Southern law demands a life for treason, Vane explained. Eris waged an illegal war against your keep. He insulted your honor. The council decrees that he must die. Vane stepped back. He looked directly at Bridget. The High Council asks you to carry out the sentence, Vane continued. Strike the blow. Show the Southern Lords that you possess the strength to rule. Prove you are a true queen, and the treaty is yours. The hall fell silent. Bridget stared at the sword on the table. She understood the trap instantly. Vane wanted her to kill Eris. He wanted to turn her into an executioner. If she shed Eris's blood, she played by their brutal rules. She would prove she was just another ruthless warlord. The Southern courts would use it to label her a savage. But if she refused, Vane would report that she was too weak to pass judgment. The council would never respect a ruler who could not enforce the law. Eris raised his head. He looked at Bridget with wide, desperate eyes. Please, Eris whispered. His voice cracked. I only followed orders. They told me to break you. Robert watched Bridget. He did not interfere. He did not offer advice. He trusted her mind entirely. Bridget reached out. She picked up the short sword. The hilt felt cold and unfamiliar. It lacked the balanced weight of her own dagger. She stood up. She walked around the table and stopped in front of Eris. Eris squeezed his eyes shut. He braced for the strike. Bridget looked at Vane. The older diplomat watched her with a faint, expectant gleam in his eyes. Bridget raised the sword. Then, she turned her wrist and slammed the blade down hard onto the oak table. The loud crack echoed off the stone walls. She left the weapon embedded deep in the wood. Eris flinched, opening his eyes in shock. I will not do your dirty work, Vane, Bridget said flatly. Vane frowned. You refuse the justice. I refuse your definition of it, Bridget replied. She walked back to her chair and sat down. Blood feeds the ground. It does not feed my people. A dead man offers Blackrock nothing. She looked at Eris. You thought we were animals. You thought starvation would make us turn on each other. You were wrong. She turned her gaze back to Vane. Her voice hardened into iron. Blackrock accepts the treaty on our terms, Bridget dictated. The White City will pay a tax on all goods traveling through the northern passes for 50 years. You will send 10 wagons of iron and 20 wagons of grain every autumn. If a single wagon is late, we close the borders permanently. Vane opened his mouth to argue. The terms were economically devastating. And Eris lives, Bridget interrupted before Vane could speak. He will not return to the south. He will work in the northern salt mines. He will swing a pickaxe for the rest of his days. His labor will pay for the food he tried to steal from my cellars. Eris gasped. The northern salt mines were a notorious death sentence of slow, agonizing labor. The darkness and the cold would break his mind long before his body failed. A lifetime in the mines is cruel, Vane noted carefully. It is practical, Bridget corrected. We need salt. Hafred let out a low, rumbling laugh. The old general nodded his approval. Vane looked at the embedded sword. He looked at Robert. The lady has spoken, Robert stated. Sign the treaty, Vane, or join Eris in the mines. Vane picked up a quill from the table. He signed his name at the bottom of the parchment. He did not say another word. He turned and walked out of the hall, leaving Eris weeping on the floor. Take him away, Robert ordered the guards. The guards dragged Eris out. The heavy doors closed, leaving Robert and Bridget alone in the vast room. Bridget exhaled slowly. She leaned back in her wooden chair. The tension drained from her shoulders. She looked at the short sword still stuck in the table. Robert walked over to the table. He pulled the sword freer and tossed it aside. He leaned against the wood and looked down at her. His amber eyes held a fierce, profound pride. You outmaneuvered the entire Southern court, Robert said softly. They only understand leverage, Bridget replied. She rubbed her tired eyes. I gave them a choice between gold and war. They always choose gold.
You spared his life. I mind him useful, she corrected. Robert reached out. He pulled her gently from the chair. He wrapped his arms around her waist and drew her close against his chest. Bridget rested her head against his shoulder. She listened to the steady rhythm of his heart. The winter was truly over. They had survived the siege, the spies, and the politics.
You do not need my sword to rule, Robert murmured into her hair. You conquered the White City with a ledger. I need you, Bridget answered. She tilted her head up. Robert lowered his mouth to hers. He kissed her deeply. It was not a desperate grasp for survival, but a quiet celebration of their shared victory. The shadows of the past receded entirely, banished by the enduring warmth they had forged in the cold. Spring arrived in the valley. Wildflowers bloomed along the muddy banks of the moat, and the air smelled of wet earth. Bridget walked through the lower courtyard, holding a leather ledger. The morning sun warmed her face. She stopped near the armory doors to inspect a crate of newly forged plowshares. The blacksmith wiped soot from his forehead and offered a deep, respectful bow. They look strong, Torin, Bridget said. Forged from the southern iron, my lady, Torin replied with a grin. The soil will yield to them. Bridget made a mark in her ledger. She turned and walked toward the stables. Clara hurried down the stone steps to meet her. The young maid wore a clean linen dress, her face bright with a relaxed smile. Lord Hafford seeks you in the Great Hall, Clara announced. The Western captains have gathered. Bridget closed the ledger. Did the River Lords send their tribute? 2 wagons of salted pork arrived at dawn, Clara confirmed, and a messenger brought letters from the White City. Bridget handed the ledger to Clara. She smoothed the front of her dark blue wool dress and touched the familiar hilt of her dagger. She climbed the steps and pushed the heavy oak doors open. Sunlight poured through the high clerestory windows. The great hall hummed with quiet conversation. The Western lords did those small groups, wearing their formal leather armor. They stopped talking when Bridget entered. They turned to face her. No one sneered. No one whispered. They simply bowed their heads as she walked down the center aisle. Robert stood on the raised stone dais. He wore a dark tunic fastened with a silver clasp. He looked rested, the deep shadows beneath his amber eyes gone. He watched her approach with a steady gaze. Hafford stood beside the high table. The old general held a carved wooden box in his hands. Bridget stopped at the base of the stairs. You summoned me. Robert stepped forward. He raised a hand, and the hall fell silent. The snow has melted, Robert said. His deep voice resonated off the stone walls. The southern blockades are broken. The High Council sends iron instead of assassins. We survived the winter. The Western lords nodded. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the room. We survived because our walls were thick, Robert continued. But walls do not feed an army. Swords do not negotiate trade routes. We held this keep because we had a mind sharp enough to cut through southern politics. He looked directly at Bridget. Eris thought starvation would break us. Vane thought a trap of diplomacy would divide us. They failed. Robert walked down the brief flight of stairs. He stopped 1 pace away from her. They failed because they underestimated the woman standing before me. Robert gestured to Hafford. The old general stepped down from the dais and approached them. Hafford offered the wooden box to Robert. Robert opened the lid. He reached inside and lifted a circlet. It was a beautiful piece of metalwork. It lacked the heavy gold and bright jewels favored by the southern courts. Black iron and polished western silver twisted together to form a simple, elegant band. It looked strong. It looked like the North. The White City rules with gold, Robert said. He held the circlet up. This valley respects iron. We survive the cold, and we protect our own. Bridget looked at the dark metal. Her breath hitched. She remembered scrubbing the very stones they stood upon. She remembered the fear of making eye contact with the high-born guests. "I took you from the scullery to protect you," Robert murmured, lowering his voice for her alone. "But you ended up protecting me. You broke the cage, you held the gates." He raised his voice again for the hall. "A king rules the battlefield," Robert declared, "but Blackrock needs a ruler who understands the cost of the harvest. I will not have you stand beside me as a ward or a guest. You will stand as an equal." Robert held the iron circlet over her head. "Rule beside me," Robert commanded softly. "Except the north." Bridget did not hesitate. She did not look at the floor. She lifted her chin and met his amber eyes. "I accept," Bridget said. Robert lowered the circlet. The cool metal settled firmly against her dark hair. It fit perfectly. Halford drew his broadsword. The scrape of steel echoed in the quiet hall. The old general drove the point of his blade into the floorboards and dropped heavily to one knee. "To Queen Bridget," Halford roared. Captain Thorne drew his sword and knelt. "To the Queen." The movement spread like a wave. The western lords, the captains, and the castle guards drew their weapons and dropped to their knees. A chorus of rough, battle-hardened voices shouted her name. The sound shook the dust from the high rafters. Bridget stood tall beneath the weight of the Iron Crown. She felt the heavy gaze of 100 men resting upon her. She did not shrink from it. She drew strength from their loyalty, rooted deeply in the trials they had survived together. Robert did not kneel. He stood beside her, a solid mountain of dark leather and quiet power. He reached out and took her hand, interlacing his rough fingers with hers. Hours later, the sun dipped below the jagged mountain peaks. The great hall filled with music and the smell of roasted meat. But Robert and Bridget slipped away from the celebration. They climbed the spiraling stairs to the highest watchtower. The night air felt crisp, lacking the bitter bite of winter. A sea of bright stars stretched across the clear sky. The valley below lay peaceful and silent. Bridget rested her hands on the stone parapet. She looked out over the dark outline of the rebuilt aqueduct in the distance. Robert stood behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her back against his chest. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "It is quiet," Robert observed. "For now," Bridget replied. She touched the cold iron of the circlet resting on her hair. "The southern lords will test the treaty eventually. They will try to find a weakness." "Let them try," Robert said. He kissed the side of her neck. "They will find an iron wall." Bridget smiled into the darkness. She felt the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart against her back. "You gave me a heavy crown," she noted. "You carried the weight of this castle long before I gave you the title," Robert answered. He turned her around to face him. The moonlight cast soft shadows across his strong features. The fierce, feral edge that had defined him during his captivity was gone. In its place stood a deep, unshakable peace. He traced the silver vines woven into her iron crown with his thumb. "When I sat in the snow on the mountain, I thought the cold had won," Robert confessed quietly. "I thought I would never escape the yard." "You're free, Robert." "I am," he agreed. He dropped his hand and framed her face. "Because I found a light in the dark." Bridget reached up and placed her hands over his. She did not need words to answer him. She pulled him down and kissed him. The kiss was slow and deliberate. It held the memory of freezing nights and the promise of 100 quiet mornings to come. It was the sealing of a bond forged in hardship and tempered by absolute trust. Robert held her tightly, anchoring her to the stone beneath their feet. The wind blew across the battlements, but it carried no threats. The ghosts of the past had finally faded. The crippled Maid had become the undisputed Queen of the North.
The Iron Wolf had found his humanity. Together, they watched the stars burn over Black Rock, ready to face whenever the dawn would bring. I just love how Bridget proved that you don't need a sword to be powerful. Her brilliant mind was her absolute best weapon. It was so satisfying to see her finally crowned. If you enjoyed this journey, please hit subscribe. I'd also love to know where you're tuning in from today, so drop your city below. Since the winter is over, what new challenges do you think they should face next? Share your plot ideas in the comments, and I'll see you next time.